As the incoming president of the American Folklore Society Fellows Society, I would like to welcome you to the Francis Lee Utley Memorial Lecture. And it is such a pleasure to introduce Simon Bronner. I'd like to begin with a few words about the Utley Lecture and about the Fellows organization itself. Established in 1960, the Fellows of the American Folklore Society is an honorary body of folklorists whose election to the Fellows signifies outstanding achievement. Members of the Fellows have contributed significantly to folklore in all of its areas of concern. Not everyone has contributed to every area, but you catch my drift. The Fellow Society has provided meritorious service to the study of folklore and to AFS as an organization. The Fellows sponsor activities for the advancement of the field and mentoring of students and junior colleagues, including an annual reception for students, the Breakfast of Folklore Champions, and consultation on Lifetime Achievement Awards. The president of the Fellows presents a plenary address in even-numbered years and selects a speaker from the Fellows in consultation with the Executive Committee in odd-numbered years. In 2010, the commemoration of the group's 50th anniversary, the Fellows named its plenary session after the organization's founder, Francis Lee Utley, who had a distinguished career as a professor of folklore at Ohio State University, The Ohio State University, and visiting professor at Berkeley and UCLA. He also served as president of the American Folklore Society, and in addition, he was president of the American Name Society and the College of English Associates. Simon Bronner is a worthy speaker in this regard, as he's been a competent and wonderful organizer for the Fellows Society. I have long thought of Simon in connection with James Brown. This is not because he is an outstanding dancer, although in fact he is, but because he's the hardest working man in folk studies. Simon has published nearly 30 book-length works, including works that he's edited and works that he's written. He has published, excuse me, I'm sorry. I have to look twice because it's hard to believe. Over 200 essays in journals and encyclopedias, over 30 chapters and introductions in books. He is a magnificent teacher of folklore and a great supporter of his graduate students, as I know from the graduate students who have gone on to him from our program at Western Kentucky. His research has been very broad-ranging, including examinations of gender studies, material culture, music. He's produced significant reference materials for the discipline. He is a valuable contributor to American studies and the history of the discipline. He is currently the director of the folklore program at Penn State Harrisburg, and I find that his title for today is particularly appropriate to one of the areas where I have found his work most useful. I love Simon's work on history of the discipline, looking at the progress of folk studies, because it's always beautifully nested in the larger social and intellectual realities. It always reminds me of the balls inside the little cages that he studied so beautifully in Chain Carver's Old Men Carving Memory. Simon's title for today is Convergences in the Hyper Era, 30 years after American Folklore Studies. Please welcome my friend and colleague, Simon Bronner.
Thank you, Erica, someone who I not only befriended, but came to respect highly, and very happy to have had projects over the years that our work can indeed converge. On the occasion of this year's 40th anniversary of Francis Lee Utley's death, in addition to being a year after the last Utley lecturer, J. Meckling's brilliant Jeremiad on the intersection of American studies and folkloristics, and the convergence of my talk with this year's Crossroads theme, I take a cue from Utley's published reflection in 1949 on what he called the intellectual highway projects of folklore studies in its second century. These projects, he observed, paved the way for an independent, fresh was his word, overarching highway discipline that would veer away from what he considered the provincial paths of anthropology and literature. He referred to extensive reference volumes and academic coursework on folklore that were credited to folklorists who self-identified as folklorists rather than anthropologists or literary scholars. The formation of the Fellows as an honorary organization equivalent to other learned societies was important, he claimed, to legitimate or ramp up folklore not as part of something else, but as its own entity. The folkloristic highway, Utley opined, would be wide open, allowing travel to new intellectual horizons. And just before his death in 1974, he wrote of his gratification that folklore studies enjoyed increased visibility on the roadside as a result. He observed under continued construction a modern, multifaceted, and forward-thinking expanse that cut widening swaths of academic terrain. The American Folklore Society conference that year was held in sprawling Los Angeles and opened with a session on the traditional expressive behavior of the peoples of the Americas. There were 31 sessions in all, compared to more than 100 this year. Utley was happy that the American Folklore Society was meeting on its own rather than alternating between the MLA and AAA meetings. He gushed at the whopping sum, or what seemed to him a whopping sum, of 100 presenters listed in a 12-page program. Some of you may have been there. What would he have thought perusing this year's 232-page program with around 500 presenters? Witnessing the scholarly and public traffic in anticipation of the centennial in 1988 of the founding of the American Folklore Society, I surveyed in American Folklore Studies at the urging of Roger Abrams and Alan Dundes on what was then the Centennial Committee of the American Folklore Society, the winding paths American scholars had taken since the 19th century to study folklore. Whereas my boss and her boss, Richard Dorson, and friend Bill McNeil, now both sadly gone, had concentrated their historiographic efforts on biographies of 19th century British and American folklorists, respectively, I linked developments in American folklore studies over its 180-year history, tracing its rise to the work in the 1820s of John Fanning Watson and Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, with a sequence of intellectual movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. Number one, the location of a hidden usable past in the 19th century. Number two, the professionalization of time and space in the early 20th century. Number three, the era of communication after the mid-20th century. The period of coverage essentially stopped in 1984, and I cheekily made predictions about the roads folklorists would likely travel into the next century. And here we are, in its third century, and I find myself contemplating folklore's trajectory both as cultural material and as a subject of inquiry, much as Utley reflected on how far folklore studies had come in the second century. I propose that folklore studies shows signs of connection with a new intellectual epoch I call the hyper era, characterized by keywords of convergence, practice, meme, and frame within digital culture and its internet superhighway, rather than the previous period's analog signification of performance, symbol, and structure. Using Thomas Kuhnian terms, I might summarize this move as less of a scientific revolution than a pre-paradigm shift caused by changing technology and altered intellectual purposes from relational to analytical approaches to culture, and I will explain that, I promise. The special significance of this hyper-era, I contend, is a reevaluation of the definition and scope of folklore from the time it emerged as a discipline in the era of communication And I also have to question, as Jay Meckling did last year, the relevance of an American or national frame of reference for folklore studies and what he called the cultural contradictions of capitalism or consumerism in an American context. Having traveled on the highways Utley observed being formed, I look back in our disciplinary vehicle's rearview mirror to see and question the road ahead. In so doing, I will confess errors in my predictions of the 1980s and revised outlooks as a result of having more quantitative data, historical projects in my book following tradition, popularizing Pennsylvania folk nation, and explaining traditions, and broader experiences outside the United States, particularly thanks to benevolent institutions of higher learning and my gracious ethnological colleagues who hosted me for extended teaching and research stays in the countries of the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Israel, Japan, China, and California. I benefited too from the growth of the new research published in the Folklore Historian, begun in the 1980s, guided by the skilled editorial hands of first Ronald L. Baker and now Jill Terry Rudy. American Folklore Studies is still in print and apparently being adopted in courses, but I recognize that it now must seem incomplete. On the other hand, I hear from folklorist teachers that they use this shortcoming to ritually slay the book and to raise discussion about the present and future of folklore studies, as if I have been silent since its writing. The period since the centennial high watermark for folkloristic activity needs assessment, either as a continuation of the intellectual highway projects that Utley described, or else a shift in the means of travel. The key distinction of the book compared to other historiographies that I recognize was its attention to the contribution of folklore studies to broader intellectual movements. It looked outward, or I hoped it would, particularly devoted to the democratization of the arts in the United States and the rationalization of folk behavior, and an understanding of the United States as a set of overlapping national, ethnic, and regional identities rather than amalgamated culture derived from sources abroad. The criticisms that my historiographical project received were that I omitted particularly historical figures as pivotal, or I did not survey scholarship of specific genres. I had the pleasure of addressing faculty and students at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn State University, Leiden University, Harvard University, Indiana University, and University of Hong Kong in departmental seminars about the work, and I understood from them the desire to have more institutional histories as well, especially as the landscape of academic preparation for careers in folklore dramatically changed in the late 20th century, with folklore studies in many cases re-embedded in other disciplines, as Utley had in his era. I accept these criticisms and would point out, as this talk exemplifies, that the project is continuing with what you shall see as one institutional kind of history of the American Folklore Society, joined by many colleagues with what seems to me a renewed interest in taking stock of the discipline, its past and its future. To wit, the coincidental organization of 3 conferences, count them, 3 conferences in 1 year. This one, the Western States Folklore Society, and the Jubilee Conference of the Society for International Ethnology and Folklore, all within this year on either crossroads or historiographical themes, attest to what structurally we should recognize as a pivotal, if not dramatic, moment. I would also add, before speeding into the fast lane of this talk, that the thesis of American folklore study still holds in my mind, or at least provides a foundation for today's assessment, namely that a rhetorical analysis of keywords used as vehicles of self-knowledge shows that, I'm quoting myself, folklore studies has followed the trends, currents, if you will, in modernist thinking about culture. These interconnections or intellectual currents reveal folklore studies to be an intrinsic part of a broad intellectual history, a history of the beliefs that Americans have held about tradition and culture. It might be the case that not enough time has passed to allow us to think of the last 30 years of intellectual projects as history. But I'm going to give it a stab because I believe that as attendance of folklorists in meetings such as this has grown and scholarly and applied production has increased, we are indeed at an intellectual crossroads and need to figure out where and how to turn from here. In addition, I hope to start a conversation taking stock of our discipline here and abroad, although there's an argument that there is convergence too, especially in light of the general lack of assessment since the centennial and what I hoped would be an occasion for more stock-taking on the 150th anniversary of William John Thom's purported coining of the term folklore. Much of my periodization in American folklore studies was based upon the frequency of keywords in selected periods. For example, the analytic use of evolution, primitive, progress, and psychic unity was concentrated in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but virtually disappeared from folkloristic usage, judging by citations in databases such as JSTOR and MLA International Bibliography. The view of the past that has predominated was linear through stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, and related to broad intellectual movements to apply Darwinian ideas of natural selection to culture. In the period that identifies the professionalization of time and space, a scientific revolution could be discerned following from physical ideas of relativism and historical particularism rather than biological ideas of evolution and progress. Keywords such as function, transmission, and diffusion represented in my interpretation relativistic ideas of simultaneity and heterogeneity related to dramatic changes in transportation, migration, and the rise of cultural nationalism. In the era of communication, roughly beginning after World War II, attention shifted to relational social action, evident in predominant keywords of community, structure, symbol, and especially later in the period, individualistic expressive performance among American folklorists. I connected the rise of communication as well to documentary technology such as television, telephone, and recording devices to this shift. Another context for the move, I contended, was the post-industrial dominance of a service and information economy that I viewed as influencing the differentiation or organization of space as cultural scenes. It also changed notions of identity as birthright heritage, rooted in a location and family line, to one that could be composed from multiple sources and enacted in various situations. A strong dramaturgical vocabulary could be detected, affected by Irving Goffman's notion of the presentation of self in everyday life, as well as the idea of individuals rather than birthright or heritage groups as agents or performers of culture. I noted in relation to economy and what Jay Meckling last year identified as layers within cultural contradictions of capitalism in America, the interest in the organization of culture by affiliations to corporations, schools, churches, centers, interest groups, and voluntary organizations as the prime location of modern Americans for play as well as for work. Prominent folklorists such as Michael Owen Jones, Gary Allen Fine, and Jay Meckling were attracted to organizational theory in line with the social psychology of culture and produced important volumes such as Inside Organizations, Studying Organizational Symbolism, On My Honor, With the Boys, and Manufacturing Tales that applied organizational and social psychological perspectives to folkloristic problems. Especially jarring in my mind was the insight of Richard Sennett, who in The Fall of Public Man of 1992 noted the decline of public culture in the modern period and the radical individualization on the one hand and extreme massification on the other. Expressive culture, artistic communication of a vernacular type, as he described it, compensates for fears of massification but are increasingly privatized and organized, even repressed. Attention-grabbing conferences on organizational culture arose with connections to what was then new domains for folkloristic inquiry, such as urban and suburban life, corporate and commercial culture, and youth cultures. Based upon these developments, I predicted that the keyword organization, again quoting myself, no matter what the political interpretation of it, portended a change in folkloristic approach. I can't say this has come to pass, although I will indicate later the way that organizational concepts have been adapted into practice theory with a connection to folkloristics. Textbooks written by American folklorists such as Living Folklore by Martha Sims and Martine Stevens and The Dynamics of Folklore by Barry Tolkien emphasize post-structural approaches and touted performance as a dominant theoretical American framework, moving away from previous structural or comparative studies of texts for the contextual or situational interpretation of folklore. Despite its logical and analytical flaws, performance, and even questions of whether it constituted a theory at all. Alan Dundee's among the eminent leaders of our field before he died in 2005, quipped that performance as a theory was glorified description, and when I was in Europe, I heard reference to it as limited for ethnological work. Frustrated by what he considered shallow microfunctional analysis or of meaning and performance, Dundes called for depth analysis, drawing on expressive culture to locate what he called cognitive patterns. Although he participated in the landmark Toward New Perspectives in Folklore in 1972 that signaled the scientific revolution for communication approaches, Dundes had an uphill battle, fighting for psychological and structural approaches. Yet one could not deny that he, in his inimitable style that many of you know, presented a byway, at least, into the town square crossroads where folklorists gathered. I will later offer reasons for the aversion to this psychological approach during this period and make a call for a project to delve into folklore as cognitive reasoning. But first, I need to establish what folklorists as a group do and the key words they actually use. Another observation I think was right. I noted the fuel by post-structural approaches that were generally non-comparative and usually did not generalize findings. Folklore was not a predictive discipline and increasingly had become presentist and even solipsist. As both Alan Dundes and Elliot Oring complained, and it's interesting to put them both together in the same sentence, too many folkloristic studies lacked hypotheses and findings, and Dundes even referred to speculations. I maintain that folklore in a future-oriented society, such as the United States, assesses the modern present and pre-modern past to guide structures for the future. This becomes even more crucial, as I wrote, folklore studies increasingly moves outside the academy as it becomes more subject to organizational differentiation, and as it lodges in governmental agencies, foundations, corporations, museums, and libraries. Numbers bear out the trend. Between 2002 and 2011, when the American Folklore Society conducted surveys of its membership, the percentage of academic to public sector employees who were folklorists was fairly evenly split, on an average of 55% in academe and 45% self-identifying themselves in the public sector. Declines could be discerned in the number of academics in English and anthropology departments, with a rise in the number of folklore area and language studies departments. Also prominent was the percentage of members who sometimes or always identified themselves as folklorists, an average of 80%, a sure sign of the entrenchment of folklore studies and what Utley identified as an independent highway. To verify the prominent keywords, identifiers, and concepts of the 30 years after American Folklore Studies, I sought more numbers. I selected the programs of the American Folklore Society between 1989 and 2004 for statistics because in those years indexes were provided for each conference. A gap exists between 2005 and 2012, but in 2013, the American Folklore Society solicited keywords from members that you provided, submitting abstracts. I used this gap to create comparisons between the earlier and later period, especially because the key words provide a cognitive map of the membership, not just the content of its leaders. The indices covered titles of panels and workshops as well as subjects of individual papers, and I checked for overlap of the subjects as well as the key words. With over 90% of the membership of the American Folklore Society residing in North America, I felt justified these numbers provided a snapshot of American folklore studies. The first proposition I want to test is whether folklore studies is still dominated by narrative and song as it had been in the era when textual analysis was considered dominant. Another reason for looking at this was the relative role of material and social cultural genres that have been associated with folklife or ethnology. In my calculation, narrative was the index subject that scored highest and would have doubled the next category of music and song if combined with an instances of legend, jokes, humor, and epic, and quadrupled if combined with literature. The high frequency of legend highlighted in brown compared with the presentations that the medievalist Utley attended in the 1970s, and even the mention of jokes as a category is a sign of a modernist or a democratizing trajectory in folklore. This is also reflected in the changing idea that everyone has folklore. At the same time, it also signaled the influence of verbal art on the definition of folklore. Despite the vision the folklore was a big tent or an umbrella for communicative expression or traditional practice in various media. Verbal genres dominated during the period, although speech did not fare well compared to narrative genres. I have highlighted the low incidence of mass media in red because in the keyword listed in the last 2 years, a new subject term of digital culture catapulted to the third spot right behind music and song. Narrative still dominated, but the relative position of material and social genres highlighted in green rose perhaps, as I will subsequently argue, because of the increased presence of self-identified ethnologists or ethnographers and their foundational concept of practice, coming out of the earlier concept of custom. Notable, for example, is the frequency of ritual and belief, which in combination was a prominent topic at the conferences. Its incidence correlates with the upsurge in the coverage of religious groups, a surprising upsurge, at least in my interpretation. Ethnological perspectives also tend to emphasize groups and communities more than folklore, and more of a profile of the study groups is apparent from a comparison of the subjects indexed between 1989 and 2004, and the presenter produced keywords in 2013 and 2014. Different labels were used in the earlier period for the African diaspora. Sometimes Africa, sometimes African American were listed separately, and other times the terms were consolidated under the headings of African and African American or African diaspora. I combined these figures under the heading of African diaspora and noted the group top the list of groups covered at AFS meetings. Variable labels were also apparent for indexing in different years according to Latino, Hispanic, and Mexican American. I combined these also into one category. The subject listed as Native American or Native peoples appeared third, and it should be kept in mind the number was elevated by meetings held during the period in Anchorage and Albuquerque that featured regional Native groups. Religious groups came in second, although I realize there's often overlap with ethnicity. But indexers chose to list religion separately. When a specific religious group was listed, it was Jewish or Catholic, and to a lesser extent Muslim. Protestants did not garner a single mention, although some subgroups such as Pentecostals, Mormons, Amish, and Lutherans did. A general subject heading of European stood behind Latino, Asian, children's, and occupational groups, but presenters on British topics apparently were not identified as European. And Irish topics were treated independent of British topics, and I checked for overlap. Regions of Scandinavia and Slavic or Eastern Europe were also covered as separate categories. Of significance to my concern for nationalistic categories, particularly for a society such as the AFS, whose original mission was to provide folkloristic research on North America, is the absence of an American or United States category. Perhaps indexers took the subject of America as a given in studies of children, Asian Americans, and African Americans. The only national or regional categorization in North America was the American South. So there you go. America is in the 6 states of the Southeast. Although the AFS met in southern cities only 3 times during the 15-year period. Some question might be made about Texas, but I noticed that presenters contextualized Texas along with California and New York as nationalistic entities rather than as part of a regional culture. And on the flight here, yes, I looked through Sky Mall. They even advertise state medallions that you can wear. And the ones that they pictured were California, Texas, and New York. Not surprisingly, when we moved to 2013, 2014, with this year's location in Santa Fe, keywords of Latino, Hispanic, Mexican predominated, but at the same time, the meeting of Providence, Rhode Island, in the heart of New England, did not produce self-identified labels for New England. Maybe Bert Feintook can explain that. Indeed, more presenters spoke about the American South than on the home region of the meeting in Providence. European scholars tended to describe their work in regional rather than nationalistic terms, and again, there was an absence of American or United States labels. Indigenous became a preferred term over native peoples in the later period, and the number of Asian and Asian American references rose. The number of keywords for occupational groups increased while family as a label dropped away from the top 10 keywords. Upon closer inspection, many of these occupational groups comprise workers in organizations and corporations, but are not listed as such. and the subjects are often about social practices rather than expressive performances of individuals. Overall, I can say the folklorists in the post-centennial years tended to use sub- or microcultures as its unit of measure. This observation raises the question of the concepts and approaches listed by folklorists as their own. If gender, feminism, and sexuality constitute a perspective rather than a topic, and many titles within the program suggest that they did, then there were more listings for these categories than any other among presenters of the American Folklore Society. Despite the number of titles on groups, ethnicity and race as a concept rated relatively low compared to gender. Where ethnicity was referenced, it was usually in connection to titles on cultural practices of Italian Americans. Mentions of performance and communication were high, but notable is a separate listing of ethnography and field research for the first time, which implied both a methodology and a situational analysis based upon observation or participation rather than a text-oriented survey or collecting work, and collecting hardly showed up at all. Related to this kind of analysis of microscenes is a listing of discourse and rhetorical analysis as a subject highlighted in orange and related apparently to questions of textual or visual representation. The combination of the two would suggest a higher frequency for rhetorical approaches, reinforcing Elliot Oring's observation in 1994 that identity constitutes a unifying principle for the discipline, if not theory, of folklore studies. Identity rated highly in titles of papers and panels through the period. Identity studies related in my check of these titles to studies of individual artists and life histories of individuals that merited separate listings as subjects. Indeed, the rhetoric of groups, even small groups, is lacking. One might point to the individualistic influence of performance of the American concern for democratized self-expression. Regardless, more challenges to the social basis of folklore were evident in the period, including Jay Meckling's psychological claim in his essay Solo Folklore as part of a special issue on folklore theory and Western folklore that the individual, rather than the group, is the locus of folkloric production because analytically the person constructs a profile through repetitive action. The narrower social focus of subjects is evident from the number of listings of place and community as concepts and the weaker showing of nationalism and regionalism. Notably absent in my estimation are the keywords of symbol, structure, transmission, and function that I identified as driving concepts of earlier periods. Arguably, the keyword of representation built upon symbolist approaches. But symbol popped up rarely in programs. With the absence of symbol is a decided lack of psychological approaches, whether psychoanalytic, behavioral, cognitive, or therapeutic. And in fact, there are hardly any references to anthropological or sociological approaches either. When they appeared, they were often in relation to children and youth cultures, ritual and belief, and jokes. One might conclude that folklorists designate their own methodologies that tend to give attention to behavior rather than to cognition, in line with the characterization of performance by Deborah Caption as patterns of behavior, ways of speaking, manners of bodily comportment in 8 words edited by Bert Feintook. Despite Dan Benamos's famous omission of tradition from his definition of artistic communication in small groups and toward new perspectives, a contemporary discourse on tradition and related concepts of authenticity and heritage grew, judging from subject listings and AFS programs, particularly as the new millennium arrived. This trend was coupled with the rise of history and memory as concepts and approaches. I observed an upswing in papers on European, medieval, and early modern folklore connections of local history to folklore work, and historical legendary accounts for this frequency. Or one can say that examining any period other than the present by a folklorist drew attention to itself as history. It should be pointed out, however, that in this period, Benamos himself wrote in a special issue on tradition and identity in 1984 for the Journal of Folklore Research that tradition is a fundamental theoretical concept, indispensable, that was your word, indispensable, in the analysis of texts, cultures, and society. Richard Bauman followed in 1992 with the pronouncement that, quote, there is no single idea more central to conceptions of folklore than tradition. Michael Owen Jones, an advocate of behavioristic approaches, concluded in 1989 that ultimately, quote, what appeals to folklorists is the study of tradition, something in which all people of every time and place engage. Whether contained in definitions of folklore, tradition was essential to folklore as the path to history or society sociology. Again, quoting Dan Ben-Amos, he said, "It has withstood its criticism and moved on to its central place." Yet, as Elliot Oring observed in Just Folklore, we cannot take it for granted. Evident in the variable repetition of practices, we need to know more of its processes, forms, and permutations. Along with tradition in the last 2 years, self-generated keywords of ethnography and field research predominated to describe a distinctive folkloristic concept or approach to the study of everyday life, obviously different from pre-World War II ideas of ethnography among peasant and aboriginal groups. Some of the questioning of ethnography concerned the nature of scholarly authority, with proposals to rename informants as collaborators and contributors. This had a bearing on the generation of meaning because, much to Dundas's chagrin, ethnographers were hesitant to suggest meanings outside the awareness of participants in cultural scenes, and hence they were averse to psychological or functionalist hypothesizing. Notable, too, is the rise of discourse on heritage at a crossroads with tradition. Perhaps the largest rise was in popular culture references, probably because of considerations of the internet, video games, smartphone texting, and animation associated with mobile digital culture. I view a connection to the discourse on heritage and tradition because of the perceived convergence of folk and popular culture, or at least a questioning of division between them in light of what increasingly was referred to as, quote, mass-mediated culture. Gender, feminism, and sexuality, primarily from women's perspectives, dropped down relative to these categories, but was still represented substantially more than ethnicity, race, and region. Sensitivity to feminist issues might derive from the growing majority of women in the American Folklore Society, 62% to 38% as of 2011, and the women's section being the largest section in the American Folklore Society. Another factor is that gender represents an embodied influence whose cultural and political significance is open to question. It is modernist in being mobile, malleable, and not tied to place. But arguably, the title suggests that there is not a reference to a unified theory or to precedents in psychology. In a scan of the numbers from the American Folklore Society, I found the increased mention of space and place, especially when coupled with community and network that referred to concepts replacing the assumption of rootedness in region, city, and country. This move implied that locality was temporary and mobile, again in light of the transitory nature of digital culture. Although related to space and place and community, sustainability, which enjoyed a spike of interest, was a theme in the Providence meeting of 2013 and did not generate as many keyword mentions in 2014. Most notable in its absence is the city, especially if AFS meetings are often located in major urban areas. I can't help but notice that after the upsurge in urban folklore of the 1970s and 1980s, the topic, once dubbed by Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett as the new frontier of folklore studies, has virtually disappeared. Perhaps this is another case where a physical environment in a mobile, dispersed society such as the United States is not considered special or worthy of intellectual advocacy. The addition of professional development workshops and panels on folkloristic careers is a sign of disciplinary maturity or economic stress, depending on your point of view. In the period after the centennial of the AFS, there's no doubt that employment in public sector institutions dominated discussions of the profession, so much so that in 2000, a special pre-conference meeting compensated by focusing on academic issues in response to a perceived general crisis in the United States in humanities education, specifically in public education generally. The figures for pedagogy and academic issues would rate even lower if it were not for this event. The last 2 years, however, education among professional issues was second only to discussions of policies related to cultural heritage, mostly intangible and intellectual property. The rise of education as a professional subject was fueled by K through 12 activities rather than graduate pedagogy in folklore. The number of presenters who specifically mentioned public sector applied work dropped, but another sign of what sociologist Ben Agger calls fast capitalism, connected to the global prosumer and new media and information technologies, folklorists increasingly took up the status of folklore as slow capitalism and its potential acceleration in 21st economic as well as cultural practices of tourism, museums, and preservation. The comparison of periods, I contend, shows a shift that I identified previously as following Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution, that a pre-paradigm crisis is apparent because of the view that the performance-centered discipline is stagnant or superficial, and therefore needs a facelift, a shot in the arm, or even, as a famed panel suggested, a name change. I would propose that much of the perception of crisis is evident in the coding of crossroads, with reference to an overstated intellectual investment in performance as a form of microfunctional interpretation rather than generalization or explanation from aggregate data and comparable frames of action. A consequence of the American emphasis on performance has been a decided concentration in American folklore studies on narrative, despite the efforts of folklife and ethnological scholars applying European perspectives, particularly and usually they emphasize social and material aspects of culture. Part of the move toward explanation is away not only from the relativistic concept of interpretation in the post-structural intellectual movement, but also one that evaluates, in Jay Meckling's term, in a structural fashion, social frames from Gregory Bateson and Irving Goffman as part of cultural systems. I would add, and I think Jay would concur, I'll let him speak for himself later, a need to seek cognitive sources or symbolist or rhetorical approaches to explain cultural practices. This move I've suggested entails a paradigmatic shift from a relational or analog definition to an analytical and digital one. Folklorists use analog textually as well as technologically in its sense of an item in a relative position to another. Further, the strategy of holding up group and context is vital to the definition of folklore as analogic because it is relational, emphasizing the immediate characteristics and fragmentation of the event or performance, whereas repetition and variation in practice, which are more commonly applied to folklore in new technology, including the internet, have a digital connotation that underscores linear continuity in aggregate data. Analog culture, often attributed to the touch-oriented world of tradition, especially in pre-modern society, derives meaning from sensory aspects of perception. Cultural practices are more often circumscribed than delineated. People derive significance from face-to-face encounters because the appearance of people, what they do, and how they do it convey a bounded functional action. Digital culture affects an intellectual worldview by emphasizing representations of reality and outcomes of messages that may not involve face-to-face interaction. Thus, it may seem to connect more people, but it judges meaning less from social relationships and appearances than from textual similarities. Arguably, in an analog context, meaning is attached immediately to events as they are perceived within a small group. It is more sensitive to the natural or immediate social context. Indeed, in explaining traditions, I suggest that folklorists are by and large have naturalistic tendencies, but that's a psychological interpretation. Analog privilege is the ground of turf, while the digital values the action of surf. Both analog and, maybe there's a James Brown connection there. Both analog and digital culture are capable of producing and expressing tradition, but they may perceive it differently. Analog culture might be said to be relational and localized with a high degree of sensitivity to experience, context, emotions, relationships, and status within a place. A view of digital deriving from a structural approach of cybernetics relies on analytical, inductive thinking that takes observable events to form informational pieces linked in causal chains and categorized into systemic criteria. Folklore, in short, comprises traditional knowledge put into practice. I move to the second section on keywords in the case for convergence in the hyper era. And a shift apparent in the rhetoric of folklore studies. Back in 1988, I noted the usage of art and performance as a sign of what Kuhn would call a formation of worldview as well as a form of puzzle solving. With the addition of big data sources in the 21st century, there's digital and analytical for you, I re-examined these assertions. Using Google's Ngram viewer with a massive database of books in various languages, we can view these general intellectual trends beyond the specifics of AFS attendees. For example, the words practice, performance, and tradition are, of course, widely used in general parlance. Indicative of Richard Sennett's views of the decline of public culture, performance, the blue line, and practice, the red line, enjoyed increased usage compared to tradition, the green line. The word shows more similar trajectories in German. When modified by various prefixes such as folk and cultural, the most significant trends occur in American English. When comparing the fairly level folk tradition with the steep trajectory in the end of the 20th century, with the red line, if you can't see that in the back, of cultural practice. Okay, Wolfgang wants to know what it looks like in German books, in which folk tradition appears to predominate in contrast to the American books of that period, and had a spike in the mid-1980s. Two of the major paths at the metaphorical crossroads was folklore and ethnography or ethnology. I include folklife because that was often the application in the United States, but it is not a significant line, as you will see in other languages. As I noted earlier, ethnography arose as not only an approach in the latter period of AFS conferences. Here in the German, ethnography has crossed and tended to predominate over folklore. And here it is in simplified Chinese. And I thank Zhuwen Zhang for explaining the background and context of what seems to be simultaneous usage. But that's another paper, or one that Zhuwen will give. In the United States, advocates of folklore suggested it as a holistic study of everyday life, much as ethnology had in Europe, but it has not displaced folklore. And American textbooks refer to folklore as tradition encompassing social and material genres as well as oral expressions. Nonetheless, Engram suggests convergence of folklore and ethnography in American English. Currently, only one section of the American Folklore Society, the Jewish section, has both folklore and ethnology in its title, probably because of its global connections to European roots of Max Grunewald's Jüdische Volkskunde of the late 19th century and S. Ansky's folklore and ethnographic expeditions to the Russian Pale of Settlement in the early 20th century. Founded in 1964, the Society for International Ethnology and Folklore notably broadcasts that combination, although the relationship has been tense with occasional efforts to boot folklore from the title. It is tempting to note the advent of digital culture or cyberculture with computer technologies as a signal context for more considerations of ethnography rather than performance, which suggests face-to-face communication. I've referred to the start of this moon earlier commensurate with the popularity of the prefix hyper to imply an acceleration of information. And at least in the limited number of papers that I attended, and maybe because I'm interested in it, I did count hyper being used 7 times, and practice being used 15 times, and performance being used 8 times. But who's counting? Hyper implies an acceleration of information in our era, and the cybernetic defiance of nature, characteristic of modernization and new communication technologies. It also questions human behavior and the kind of cognitive thinking that is forced to react instantaneously to multiple messages, often in short symbolic statements or actions. The implication culturally is that rather than being passive couch potatoes, as predicted with the rise of television prosumers, those that simultaneously produce as well as consume capital on multiple devices are forced to be always wired, always on, and therefore active, or in an analytical sense, hyper 24/7. Indeed, hyperactivity, often interpreted popularly as multitasking and defiant of natural cycles, as seen in this graph, appear to become normalized over time. It's the third line. Especially significant for folklorists rhetorically, with their attention to expressive culture, is the idea of the hypertext and hyperlink. The worldview represented by this is the notion of cultural meanings being revealed progressively at multiple embedded levels of detail. There is naturally a question of the process of expression when the chat is simulated and the identity of sender and receiver is uncertain. This kind of communicative questioning can carry over into real life. And historically, action texts, as Rhys Isaac has called them, are embedded messages in interactive encounters, such as trial transcripts. Folklorists, for example, have long noted the convergence of gesture and voice in storytelling or in crafts, such as my work on elderly woodcarvers. No, that's not me. That's Mr. Hoosier folklorist Ron Baker, who I brought over to meet NEA Heritage Fellowship woodcarver, who asked him if he had ever seen that, and thank God Ron said, no, I never have. And he lit into what I thought was a ritual practice. I noted the rituals of showing chains to younger people that conveyed layers of messages about the value of pre-industrial life, their aging and imminent death, and manliness as the male body declines. Communication scholar Henry Jenkins has suggested the phrase convergence culture to represent the new flow of content across multiple media platforms and the migratory behavior of media audiences in search of social entertainment in a digital age. Media convergence has raised in this year, more so than in others, the relation of folk and popular culture that can be analyzed in the folklorization of media in local, national, and globalized contexts. I note work along these lines already among you in the last few years on cultural practices, as you yourself describe them, in the do-it-yourself movement, quilt making online, vernacular, photography, online humor, and organizationally in gaming communities and 12-step programs. I understand that not everyone who used my essay on folklore and the internet on symbolizing, virtualizing folklore appreciated my psychoanalytic interpretation of the folk web as latrinialia, with the suggestion that the praxis of computer usage has a cultural reference in its comparison to anal ejective function. But regardless, my point was that the query of cognitive sources is essential to grasp why people do what they do, why they repeat themselves, and why they act or practice on what they believe. We might look additionally to the concept of symbolic convergence suggested by Ernest Borman in the 1970s to account for what he calls, quote, human communication in terms of homo narrans. It is here that the keyword group makes a comeback. In keeping with the social interactionism and the pragmatic philosophical tradition, social theorists, rather than folklorists, using symbolic convergence, explain, if not predict, the appearance of a group's cohesiveness in this hyper-era, often emphasizing the social construction of fantasy and the enactment of storytelling in a modern organizational context. They have applied this perspective to groups as varied as the Puritans, the Knights of Columbus, adult heritage learners of Spanish, and the women's movement. In Borman's influential fantasy and rhetorical vision, the rhetorical criticism of social reality, he found that fantasy themes are used to construct a rhetorical vision or to dramatize messages embraced by the whole group. He even referred to sagas, his word, as telling of the accomplishments in the life of an individual, group, organization, or a larger entity such as a nation. And what about the nation as a unit of measure? Is my designation of an American Folklore Studies back in 1986 outdated? The data from the AFS would suggest that it is. And the organization's executive director in 2011, Tim Lloyd, kindly in a paper he provided from Western States Folklore Society, suggests that the society itself reflects a globalizing trends with 1 in 6 proposal at the Bloomington meeting, and you said 1 in 6 this year as well, coming from international scholars. He proudly announced that the AFS would undertake partnership with folklore organizations in China, Japan, and Mexico, certainly indicating a transnational trend. Folklorists, he observed, would be more digitally converged than globally connected. That's not such a big prediction, Tim, but if the hyper-era suggests more transnational movement, then I contend that a discipline such as folklore can better monitor changing conduits of transmission and movements of ideas. We cannot dispel boundaries altogether because writers still refer to contrasts of European, American, and Asian intellectual traditions. Despite globalization and the suggestion that the South is the only remaining American folk region, the nation-state in this hemisphere still carries weight as an intellectual, indeed an organizational context and rhetorical usage. One proposal to explain new media's special hold in the American Folklore Society is that the American preoccupation with the constructiveness of culture counters the European emphasis on the rootedness and givenness of folk culture in the natural landscape and the Asian perception of groupness constituted by social homogeneity and historical antiquity. With the decentralization of graduate education and folklore into myriad interdisciplinary fields that Francis Lee Utley barely envisioned, American Studies has emerged as a major producer of folkloristic scholarship, including a program at the University of North Carolina actually embedded in American Studies as well as ours. Among my American Studies doctoral students, many of them are here, I might mention, for example, Active Discussion of Themes of the American Dream by John Price, beliefs having a bearing on cultural practices varied as Mormon children games forming a social frame within the sacred frame of the church by Jared Rife. Fart lore emerging to compensate for male anxieties by Trevor Blank. Representations of traditional home cooking in American fast food practices by Jennifer Dutch. Croatian dance organizations in a Rust Belt industrial town that intersects religion with memory culture. Hunfest and its rivals that at once stigmatize and glorify the vernacular in Baltimore by David Puglia, and South Asian American religious consumerism that changes the regional connections of ritual and places women more in control in the United States than it does in India. You must like these applications of practice theory and frame theory because each one of these received awards from different sections of the American Folklore Society. In my essay, Practice Theory in Folklore and Folklife Studies, I pointed out that the legacy of European scholars conceptualizing folklore as cultural practice in contrast to the American individual-centered worldview of performance. I referred, in fact, to the observation of this contrast by Peter Jan Margry and Herman Rutenberg in their reframing of Dutch cultural studies and their consideration of what they called American methodologies. They sought a convergence of the two with an explanation of everyday practices and cognitive or unconscious sources as well as functional rationales. It might be that some resistance resulted from the association of practice with the applied aspect of theory, rather than, as ethnologists imagine it, the emphasis on repetitive variable behavior or praxis from the Greek in everyday life. This kind of practice theory reacts to the presumption that social rules and rule-bound institutions or organizations produce both individual conformity to society's dictates and social equilibrium. It focuses on the repetitive and symbolic strategies of action taken by non-conforming individuals to clarify power relations among different socio-political levels and the forms and situations these individuals use to create identities and traditions. Many practice theorists seek not a microanalysis but a macro perspective on the process of norm building, or what folklorists might identify as traditions. Whereas anthropologist Clifford Geertz was sometimes criticized for assuming that social structures determine cultural action, Anthony Giddens suggested a duality in which action can also create these very structures. The repetition of practices by individuals seen participants viewed as agents reproduce a social structure. It was on this basis, for example, that I approached hunting, a strangely overlooked topic, or not so strangely in light of the data presented today. I examined it as an action or social praxis that drew symbolic attention to itself and is based upon instrumental, repetitive actions within a social frame recognized and constructed by participants. Or considered the applied folklore or stir caused by the suggestion of a pedagogy of communities of practice. Based upon the effect of social learning, the author Etienne Wenger claimed to have derived the idea from African folklore and ethnography, and it has created a convergence of formal educational pedagogy and ethnographic insights on vernacular learning. The folkloristic contribution or precedent, what philosopher Theodore Shatsky in 2001 called the practice turn in contemporary theory, I propose is to view tradition as a kind of shapeable, contestable norm within which social agency can be enacted. Folklorists, for their praxis, can develop ideas of action that involve sorting, organizing, arranging, and identifying choices that take into account or constitute perceptions of what is traditional and new, what is repeated and ritualized, and what is usage and custom. If the orientation toward performance is open to criticism for ending assessment of folk arts as the expression of behavior, organization of study around practice extends a depth psychology of the cognitive sources and motivations for a broader range of repeatable actions and processes we recognize as traditions. A theory from practice for folklore grounded in expression as activity and doing as symbolic is ultimately a turn of mind. The road ahead, and my conclusion. I do not mean to suggest today that the hyped question of why people repeat and express themselves excludes others. I was struck delving back into the questions Francis Lee Utley posed in 1970 that still should command our attention in the future. He asked rhetorically, shall folklore be studied, these are his questions, shall folklore be studied in its psychological deep structure as well as its surface structure? Can we divorce the local and ethnological from the worldwide and anthropological? Can we use folklore to revitalize the university and to help solve some of the problems of a tense society? Can we establish a theoretical model or a series of them which will make us into an authentic science? End quote. He thought that to answer these questions, every curriculum of folklore study should have an introduction to folklore, American folklore, African American folklore, and separate courses on the folk tale and folk song. In the years that followed his death, additional subjects and approaches complementing an era of communication within an American context emerged, such as performance, folk arts, legend, humor, gender, and identity. I would suggest that based upon developments in the hyper era, we see categories of computational and virtual folklore, belief and ritual, and globalism taking center stage. I also hope for more of a concerted effort for psychological and historical approaches to and explanations of folklore. In a personal moment as a senior folklorist, not much older than I am now, Utley told his audience that the future looks to me very bright for our community and for our science. I would echo his optimism and suggest that we indeed have formed an extended and rather hyper community of practice along the digital superhighway. We still need to engage the past, and as one recent conference proclaimed, future folklore, I eagerly anticipate your keywords and convergences and superhighway projects down the road. Good travels to you, Fort Cuisine-Hey, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you. My chair says that there is some time for some questions, but if you have a question, our media people ask if you could use the microphone so that you can be heard on our digital superhighway. Erica, you have a question? Oh, do you have a question, Christina?
Thank you, Simon. That was quite a trip you took us on. Pretty impressive. I have a question about...
Is that on?
Can you hear me? I have a question about the keywords, especially the ones for the AFS, because actually I had mentioned this to Tim earlier today that folktale and fairy tale are missing as keywords for this conference. And there are many sessions, actually, and well-attended sessions on these folk narratives. Legend is present.
Yes.
Myth is, personal narrative is. So I don't remember how we were told to choose the words. Maybe they were words that were not part of the titles or something like that. I'm just curious, and I want also just to know if you've thought about this particular genre in relation
I did,
to all this.
in fact, as a participant observer of providing the keywords. They are open-ended. I don't know if Tim wants to say more about then how it was converted into the publication, which I used as my data. I should say overall, as to show the signification of this data, I counted over 7,000 incidences of keywords. So it's a substantial database, and I think valid from that point of view. Early on in the period, if I was to expand this and subdivide the 15-year period Folktale does show up as a keyword or a subject listed as an index, but it very quickly gets dominated by narrative, and I would interpret that as part of the post-structural trend. Narrative is not only all-encompassing, but it suggests an action rather than the textualist folk tale. I do see a comeback of fairy tale in the keywords that were listed in the last 2 years, which may signal that it's being looked at rhetorically or in terms of discourse or representation, not just as a static form. But that would be my interpretation, and it would take more digging into the abstracts themselves to see if that holds up. There is actually a computational tool called Navivo, which allows you to dump large amounts of data and be able to code it for these kinds of investigation. But it's one of the examples that certainly fits, although, again, as a matter of interpretation, jokes are on the rise. And that is a form, but one could argue that with the, and I think Eliot has argued this, that with the addition of jokes, you're starting to deal much less with an historical frame and more so with this micro-functional kind of frame of action of joking as well as jokes.
Simon, I was both intrigued and perplexed by your organizing concept of hyperlinks and hypermedia and hypertext and digitalization. And I think to some of us this is not so new. It goes back to a number of initiatives in the 1990s when hypertext fiction and the digital humanities were all foreseeing this future of hyperlinked information, and the digital commons was envisioned, even if it wasn't quite on your entirely wired cell phone, tablet, computer life, and so on and so forth. And at that point, I don't think that people were thinking that the relational era was analogical, but that we were entering a relational era understood through these hyperlinks. And so I was confused by your suggestion, if I understood it correctly, that we're leaving a relational period and entering an analytical one. I would have reversed it and dated it perhaps from the 1990s. I think also that with the rise of ecological thinking, that interdependence as a concept for linking is relational, and that we're moving towards a relational epistemology, or at least I am, and I think some others are as well. So I'm confused by what you were saying, and would hope that you might be able to elaborate on it.
I can explain my thinking on this. I am not claiming that this is totally new. In fact, suggesting that it is, as I said, a pre-paradigm shift. The essential question that I was trying to look at is, what have the changes, if there has indeed been a dramatic change of a new era, has that affected, or will it affect, the way that we analyze folklore? And what I see actually is, as you saw with the connection symbolic convergence and others, that folklorists are somewhat behind on this broad intellectual trend. In earlier periods that I noted, folklorists were often at the forefront of this, but I give credit that certainly a good number of you are involved in looking at what we would call hypertext analysis, or looking at digital or virtual analysis, and certainly there have been recent books on that. The analytical, it is true, may be throwing you off, especially because we use or have used the analytical in, as Dan Benamos did in the analytical genre, and others do in the analysis primarily of structure. We talk about structural analysis as an analytical form. We're talking about internal consistency and forms, and sometimes even morphology. The trend that has sometimes been called the era of convergence, or the hyper era, I've also seen referred to as the cloud era, and needed to make a decision on that, is that the dramatic change that the digital, virtual, cybernetic era, whatever you want to call it, is the rethinking not only of the present, but also past forms in this kind of embeddedness. And that is returning us to the text, which assumes an analytical stance. The relational stance is taking the whole sum of works of Irving Goffman and Geertz, and we can name a lot of others, including folklorists at the lead of this, Roger Abrams, Dan Benamos, Richard Bauman, and certainly others that are looking at social relations as generating meaning. And that is the relational part to which I am referring. And increasingly, although that is still a factor that people refer to, they're also trying to cover instances in which that is not a factor. Or, as Jay Meckling mentioned, even how someone relates to his or herself. And therefore, they're producing expressions that are individualized, that therefore are analytic, and particularly on the computer, when you don't even know the person or persons or what kind of an audience you have. So my point is that it changes not only the form of analysis, but as Kuhn mentioned, the worldview about the nature of expression and how it is produced. Because now it has a consumer aspect to it as well as a production aspect, and that's the idea of the prosumer in modern expressive culture.
I'd like to thank you all for being here on behalf of the AFS Folklore Fellows, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Simon for penetrating and provocative Francis Lee Utley talk. And have a great Santa Fe evening.